All right. I think everything is working. I'm here with Bob Wright. I don't know if you remember, I was on Blogging Heads with you
Oh yeah.
years ago. I had a
Mm-hmm.
very
Sex at
sex
dawn.
at dawn, right? The
I don't mean we had sex at dawn. I mean we talked about the book.
yeah, yeah. And I remember, I don't know where you said this, but I remember somewhere you said that since the Holy Bible, no book had been so mistaken about the evolution of human sexuality or something like that. I was really honored.
I don't know, but if I said it, you can use it as a blurb. Feel free. I'm just trying to help.
Has anyone done that? Has anyone taken like the most sort of noteworthy critical statements of a book? You know, this book is a complete piece of trash, and just like put those on the back cover.
That's a great idea. I think I have seen that kind of thing. People wearing the scorn of their enemies as a badge of honor. But I'm not aware of it actually being put on the jacket of a book. Publishers generally don't have that kind of sense of humor.
Exactly. You have to self-publish.
Um,
Well, I never considered you an enemy though, because The Moral Animal is one of the most important books I've ever read in the sense of changing the trajectory of my life. I was working on, I was in graduate school and I was working on something totally different as a potential dissertation when I read The Moral Animal, and I dropped what I was doing and just got totally obsessed with evolutionary psychology and, trying to make sense of sexuality and why men are the way they are and women and the miscommunications and all that stuff. And it was all because not only the information that you introduced me to in that book, but the grace and humor and elegance with which you presented it. It was so well done, interweaving the biographical information about Darwin with the conceptual information that you were conveying, that it just blew my mind. I ended up disagreeing with a lot of it, but it's what got me
right.
into it.
It was so well done that it took you years to discover that it was wrong, right?
Well, I don't think I told you this story, but when I read that book, I was living in San Francisco with a woman who was a stripper at Mitchell Brothers Theater, which is sort of this legendary strip club in San Francisco. And you turned me into like a proselytizing evolutionary psychologist. I was running around explaining to everybody why men and women thought the way they did based upon what I'd read in your book. And she,
I might have warned you against. I might have warned you against that, by the way, if you had checked with me. That can work and it cannot work depending on who you're talking to. But go ahead. How did the stripper take the
well,
news?
she was like, I presented the sort of central argument that, women have traded fidelity for various goods and services over the millennia. Protection, status.
I'm not sure I would have put it. I'm not sure. By the way, I'm not sure I would put it exactly that way. But I won't keep interrupting.
That's why you're here.
Women. I should say. I mean, evolutionary psychology does not argue that women are by their nature faithful. That is not an argument from evolutionary psychology.
But they do use their fidelity as a bargaining chip in exchange, right?
Well,
Male paternity certainty is a concern.
well, I mean, they use and when we say they use it as a bargaining chip, it doesn't mean they're consciously doing this. It means that the emotional infrastructure and what they're attracted to and what they're not attracted to kind of guides them through an implicit strategy that, in general, is what we mean when we talk about animals as if they were strategizers and as if they had been made strategizers by natural selection. We're never saying that they're necessarily conscious of the strategy, but with that as a footnote, what you would say is that one thing that's a bargaining chip is sexual access. I mean, that's the most important thing from the male's point of view. Again, at least the unconscious point of view. Getting access to a scarce sexual resource a scarce reproductive resource, which is to say, a woman's sexuality. Now you're right that if it may be in the woman's interest, if she wants to sustain the male's investment in the offspring, to either actually be faithful or convince the male that she is faithful. I mean, again, and he's not even necessarily consciously thinking, oh, she's being faithful, so I'll assume this kid is mine and be very nice to the kid. But again, the argument is that all this works at an unconscious level, but it's certainly a viable evolutionary strategy for a woman to be fooling around on the side and not get caught by the man and still sustain some parental investment, or conceivably get by without investment, although it's thought, and by investment we don't mean dollars, we mean the father's concern and attention and care for and provision for the offspring. But there is reason to think that during evolution, a male's support in child rearing would have been a very good thing. So either leaving one male under the impression that he's, again, the unconscious impression that he's the father, like with great confidence, or at least, could in principle work to have a lot of males under the impression that they may well be the father. That seems to be the way it works more like with chimpanzees.
So why would so much of it be unconscious, and yet this idea that the male is the father is presumably a conscious thing? Why would it not just be that the male feels a sense of affection for the woman because he's, maybe sharing pleasure with her sexually, and therefore is helpful and feels affection towards her child? Why is that part conscious where all the rest of it is functioning on an unconscious level?
Any of it could, in principle, function on an unconscious or conscious level. Like it could be that natural selection designs an animal to be consciously preoccupied. Conscious at different levels. It's like a male is consciously aware of whether he thinks the woman is being faithful. That part's happening at a conscious level. In the human species. That's different from saying, first of all, that he's consciously aware of the rationale. Like, I want my genes to be the ones, So there's that distinction. But there's also the fact that it could be a little conscious and a little unconscious, for example, baboons act as if male baboons, and I should say, look, I haven't written about this stuff in decades, so for all I know, everything I say is wrong. Okay, but I'm pretty sure I remember, male baboons, infanticide is not uncommon. If they happen upon a female who already has an offspring, the male may kill the offspring, and then mate with the female. Now, for all we know, there's no reason to think baboons are particularly conscious of anything. The point is just that animals can act as if they are consciously pursuing a strategy that makes sense in Darwinian terms, and not, in fact, be conscious of much of anything, for all we know.
Yeah.
It's
interesting how these things play out. Are you familiar with the Mosuo people in southern China?
No.
They're interesting because they sort of are a counter example of the conventional views of paternity or paternal investment. In their society, which has existed for centuries, Marco Polo passed through there and wrote about them in his travels. The paternal investment comes from the mother's brothers, not the mother's sexual partners.
The Trobriand Islanders, I've heard of cultures like that. I think the Trobriand Islanders were probably like that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There can be men who have particular roles in supporting the woman and her offspring, but the assumption that those men will be sexual partners and that there's some sort of fidelity, that seems slippery to me. But
yeah, but remember, again, I'm not assuming women are faithful. That isn't predicted by Darwinian theory particularly, but note what's happening when in a culture where there's a lot of promiscuity. That is to say, the average woman is having sex with a number of men or something. So it's really hard to say who is the father. In a case like that, the male that can say with highest confidence, and again, he wouldn't consciously say it necessarily, but the male who can say with highest confidence that he has a close relationship to the woman's offspring is in fact her brother.
Right.
Okay? Because he shares half her genes, so he shares 1/4 of the genes with the child. And if there's enough promiscuity, there's no other male, including all the ones who've had sex with her, who have that degree of confidence of paternity. I mean, if you're less than 50% sure that you're the father, in other words, you're less than 50% that you have that half of your genes are in the offspring, then you have less confidence than that brother does. Okay? So the pattern you're describing has in fact been used by evolutionary psychologists to argue, and I'm not even necessarily buying into this, to argue that this represents an adaptive Darwinian mechanism designed to take care of your genes in an environment of promiscuity. I don't know if it's the case, but it makes sense on paper.
Sure, it's sort of converging with an inclusive fitness approach to mating, right? It's
Yeah. I mean, inclusive fitness is always the bottom line, more than that's the kind of fitness that's always the bottom line.
Right.
Yeah.
Listen, I didn't want to bog you down in debating evolutionary psychology necessarily.
I didn't come here planning.
I just want to say, I love your, I mean, I got a lot of, Casilda and I co-authored the book, and as you would expect, there was a lot of positive and a lot of negative, but yours was the most negative comment I remember. So,
it's funny because I don't. Are you sure I'm the one who said that? I may. It's a kind of thing I would say. It's just that what I remember about the conversation is that because it had been a while since I had really paid attention to the literature, right? Because I'd written the book quite a while ago and then moved on to write about something else. I didn't feel that I had sufficient mastery of all the relevant material and the material relevant to all the kind of questions and seeming counterexamples you were raising, to really give you a super hard time in the conversation itself. I was trying to be a gently skeptical inquirer, but maybe I failed. I don't know.
No, being compared to the Bible, come on, man, that's fantastic.
I meant that in a nice way.
I hope you meant the New Testament. You write about everything. I mean, look, I've written 2 books, and they're basically about the same thing. And I look at your career, and I feel like, I don't know, I feel like a bench warmer who has a really good idea of what it's like to be the first stringer. Like, I don't think readers know how hard it is to do what you do. Have you always, I mean, you write about politics, you write about religion, you write about philosophy, you write about evolution. Is there a grand unifying theme to your work, or do you just see something and say, oh, that's interesting, I'm going to write about that next? What are you trying to do? Is there a plan here?
I like to think there's a grand unifying theme. I mean, first of all, I would point out that book-wise, I haven't been all that prolific at all. You're right. I've written about different things, and there's been a background of non-book writing that makes me, on balance, not ashamed of my output. But I'm not one of these super prolific people. But the unifying theme is actually, this is a good opportunity to plug something. So I'm putting out a newsletter now called the Nonzero newsletter, and I've made it the home of what I'm calling the Apocalypse Aversion Project. I mean, that's happening kind of. I mean, there's a paid version and an unpaid version, and some of that stuff is happening inside the paywall. But the that at least points to a lot of what I've been interested in. What the term? I mean, it's obviously kind of ironic term, but the idea is humankind. Okay, so life has been on this planet like 3.5 billion years or something, and it is reached higher and higher levels of organization. Okay, reached the level of the simple cell, the so-called prokaryotic cell, then the complex cell, the eukaryotic cell. Then those cells got together into multi-celled organisms. Then those organisms got together into societies of multi-celled organisms. So you've ascended several levels of organization. And then in our species, although we're not the only species with what you could call cultural evolution, that is to say, the intergenerational transmission of information that's not genetic and it's kind of selective retention, we have a robust version of cultural evolution. Technology, political ideas, religious ideas, the whole thing. And that evolutionary process has carried the level of organization of our species from the level of like hunter-gatherer society 20,000 years ago to chiefdom, city-state, and so on. And now we're on the verge of forming a global community. That's at least now technologically possible, a relatively harmonious global community. And I think we have to cross the threshold or it's going to be very bad for us. At a minimum, the world's nations have to start cooperating systematically to solve a lot of problems, a number of them existential. The most famous problem of this kind that requires kind of urgent national cooperation is climate change, but I think there are a lot of others. And we're just wasting our time in pointless, ridiculous conflict and just mindless wars, and we're manipulated by politicians into hating people we shouldn't hate and so on. The Apocalypse Aversion Project, again, kind of an ironic name, but is an attempt to look at like how you go about solving this problem. And there are a lot of entry points, a lot of things you could do about it. There's specific policies, there are forms of international governance, there are parts of human psychology I think you have to work on, like this kind of psychology of tribalism or whatever you want to call it that we're all burdened with. But to get back to your question, I think a lot of my books have been relevant to this. So like a lot of the moral animal which you mentioned and characterized very generously. There's a fair amount of that is about, or at least a kind of, I would say, somewhat climactic part of it is about how distorted our view of the world is. We're designed, it gets partly to the psychology of tribalism. We're designed to think that we're morally better than the other person. We did more of the work for the project. They did less. When the project goes awry, that's their fault and not our fault. If somebody is at odds with our own interests, then we decide they're bad people and immoral people and they should be thwarted and so on. So that book is relevant to this. My book Nonzero is relevant in a much more direct way. In fact, when I described that whole 3.5 billion years of life up to us being a globalized society, that kind of was a lot of Nonzero. My book, The Evolution of God, was relevant. And then my last book was about Buddhism and Buddhist meditation, and that was, framed in part as being an approach to our all trying to become at least slightly more enlightened beings who are slightly less deluded, and as a result, less prone to pointless conflict. So I do see a kind of a unifying theme. And I don't know. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and so I think like evangelizing is kind of something I can't get away from.
Yeah. Well, this morning I was reviewing your books and sort of thinking about it, and I did feel like there was a unifying theme there. And that's what I like, how to live in the world. I didn't connect it to your newsletter, but clearly that's the latest manifestation of it. How to see more clearly, like how to sort of remove ourselves, cleanse ourselves of cultural illusions or religious illusions or, whatever institutional baggage we're carrying. I'm in a place right now, actually, you may have been here for all I know. It's a little town called Crestone, Colorado. It's way up in the Rocky Mountains. It's at 8,000 feet at the base of 14,000 foot mountain range. It's like a little piece of Tibet dropped into the Rocky Mountains. There are over 20 religious centers in this tiny little town, Zen Buddhists and Carmelite nuns and all these different religions from around the world, because this wealthy couple granted land to these different religions, and they came here and built retreat centers. So there are stupas.
I didn't know about that. It sounds like a good place.
Yeah,
to be.
you might want to check it out. It's there's a Zen center here that's like 300 rooms, I think. They have pretty large gatherings, and they also have isolated cabins up in the mountains, so people do 30-day silent retreats in solitude. And cool. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting spot. But I was thinking about Buddhism, and I'm not a Buddhist, but of any organized religion, I think that's the one that I resonate with the most deeply. I did a 10-day Vipassana retreat a few years ago, and I've spent a good bit of time trying to meditate over the years. But it's interesting because Buddhism sometimes makes me feel kind of hopeless, because I feel like, I don't know, this is very incomplete thought, but as you were speaking, I was thinking one of my frustrations is that I'm also trying to clarify our vision of things and find a path into a future that's a lot better than the trajectory we seem to be on. But it feels like the people who rule the world are not interested in the kinds of things that you and I are saying.
You've noticed that too.
It's like political power and wisdom seem to have disconnected, and they're on two totally different paths.
Yeah. It's funny. This is just reminds me. I do a weekly. I do a podcast called The Wright Show, but I do two a week. One of them is with this old frenemy of mine named Mickey Kausch, and just last week I was saying, the Andrew Cuomo. I don't know when this is going to air, but Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, has been under fire for sexual harassment and stuff. And I was saying, what if the Me Too movement was so successful that men could no longer convert power into sexual access, and so the kinds of men who pursued power became like a different kind of man. I'm not saying all men who pursue power try to convert it into sexual access, but obviously, as the Me Too movement has demonstrated, there are some prominent ones who do, and it's a tendency. And I was just. And anyway, that falls under the general heading that your question reminds me of, is how could we get more people in positions of political responsibility who really have the interests of the world at heart? I think it happens sometimes. I mean, I think Jimmy Carter was pretty well-intentioned. I mean, a lot of them will convince themselves they're well-intentioned, in fact. But so often when push comes to shove, it's just about maintaining their control on power and maximizing the chances that they'll win the next election and so on. But it really is. This is one of the things I'd like to try to figure out as part of this apocalypse aversion project thing is like, how do you apply, like, suppose you could get grassroots traction, a group of people who share this view of the problem, and you're going to try to apply pressure and get politicians to be more responsive to the world's actual needs, or get newspapers to do a better job of covering things. I'm starting to think more about, whether the pattern you're describing could actually be changed. I mean, you're absolutely right? I mean, people who are willing to do the things you have to do to reach a high level of political power, and often corporate power, right, are just often people who have a kind of character or a set of priorities that renders them not the ideal stewards of power, right?
Yeah, I feel like our entire civilization is organized on the principle that drive for power is a good thing, whereas from my perspective, drive for power or money or fame or any of these things is an indication of an imbalanced psyche, that there's something wrong. Your daddy didn't love you enough. Your mother abandoned you. You were raised in poverty. You couldn't get laid as a teenager. Whatever it is, it's a wound that you spend the rest of your life trying to address and never really do. And so the entire trajectory of the society is driven by these people who don't have their shit worked out. So, I mean, I think, I wrote about this in my last book, which is called Civilized to Death. And there's a whole section in there about hunter-gatherer politics. And, the thing in hunter-gatherer societies is if you show any desire for power or to be in a position of leadership, you're considered ridiculous. That's a laughable, absurd, pathetic hunger to have. And so I think that's what we need to do in the Western world. We need to draft people into political positions. We need to take someone who's totally uninterested in being a leader and saying, all right, it's your turn, Bob Wright. You're going to be president now. Yeah. And you're saying, no, I don't want to be president. I'm busy. My life is great. Like, sorry, dude, you owe it to us. It has to actually be public service.
Yeah. This is again an area where we could, if we wanted to, get into an argument about evolutionary psychology, because I don't think a thirst for power is unnatural in the way you think it is probably. But you're right that hunter-gatherer societies are good at keeping any such thirst from upsetting the society too much. We might disagree over whether they're actually successfully repressing something that's natural or something that's unnatural, but it's certainly true that, they're relatively egalitarian for two reasons. One is that there isn't, not a ton in the way of material abundance to be unequally distributed, but that aside, they often do have ways of putting people in their place. Richard Wrangham, he's a primatologist. I have no idea if this is true, and I wouldn't call him he's not like an evolutionary psychologist. He's just a primatologist with a theory, but he thinks that more often than we might imagine throughout history in situations like that, they've actually killed the guy.
Sure.
if he got too out of control. He thinks that is itself something that has shaped human evolution.
Yeah, Christopher Boehm has written about this as well, in a hierarchy in the forest.
Yeah.
Yeah, that everyone's been armed for at least 100,000 years. Everyone's been armed and deadly. So it doesn't matter if you're a big, aggressive guy. You're just as likely to be shot in the back as anyone else.
Well, and if you piss off enough guys in your village, it doesn't matter if there aren't any arms. Any three guys can kill any one guy, and anyway, he thinks that's been a thing. But the point is, what everyone here is agreeing on is that there have been mechanisms for keeping people from abusing power. And in a modern technological society, there are ways for people to amass incredible amounts of power I mean, first of all, now in America, incredible amounts of wealth, which translates into power. But also, in some societies, I don't think there are any true autocrats where one person can do whatever they want and they don't have to get the consent of anybody else. But there are people in some countries who have an incredible amount of political power. And there are people in America who have more than I wish they had. I kind of agree with you. I mean, it would be, you might get some, if you just chose people out of the phone book, or whatever the current metaphor for randomness is, random selection. Yeah. Now they don't have phone books. You would probably get some bad results just as far as sheer competence goes. But on the other hand, if you could, neutralize that question and just randomly select among people who are reasonably good at, who have shown any kind of ability to work together with a large number of people or organize any social endeavor or something, you'd probably do better. I mean, it's and in a way, it's getting worse because, well, I don't know if it's getting worse or getting better now that, like in America, the discipline of the political parties is broken down. So increasingly, it's just a question of like, who's best at getting attention when primary season rolls around. It was apparently Donald Trump once, 5 years ago. And Biden's a somewhat different story, but the Democratic primary was a somewhat different story. But on the other hand, there were a lot of people in the running who, at least on stage in the debates, who you wouldn't have seen like 30, 40 years ago. Now, maybe that's good. Maybe that can work the way you're hoping things might work out, where you get somebody who just wouldn't normally be there, who takes a shot, and they're better than the average politician. But I guess what bothers me is it's still the case that you got to really, really want it, right? It's like,
yeah.
And I think one thing we're agreeing on is that often people who really, really want the power, just want it for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, you shouldn't want anything that badly. I mean, if you're attending to your life properly, you don't really need external approval. You don't need more than a sort of basic income. You don't need more than a basic house. Everything. I often equate it to red wine. I lived in Spain for 20 years, so red wine appears in my metaphors pretty often. 15-euro bottle of wine is just fine. Anyone who's spending 100 euros on a bottle of wine is just showing off. And
well, they've done studies, by the way. They've done studies showing that the people who think they can tell the difference can't. But they've also, I'm pretty sure they did one of those with a brain scan and showed that the people thinking, the way they do the study is they put a fake label on the bottle of wine. And I think they showed that when they have the fake label seeming to show that it's a rare and precious bottle of wine, that, the actual pleasure centers do light up in the brain. I mean, it works at that level. Your belief, but it's crazy.
Placebo.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It is. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, as far as the political discussion, I feel like I agree with you that the field seems to have been opened up more in the sense that someone like Andrew Yang was on the stage for a while. And one of the things I admire most about Andrew Yang is that he was on that trip. I think he went to Harvard or, Yale or some fancy school. And then he got a job in Wall Street at a big firm. And, he was doing that. And after a year, he said, wow, I'm really unhappy. And he quit. To me, that is qualification for leadership. Someone who has the courage
That's a good sign,
to disappoint his parents and quit. But what I worry about is that the American political structure and institutions are so broken that unless, in the primaries, unless you appeal to the lunatics in the party, you don't really have a chance of making it through to the general election, at least on the Republican side. and with gerrymandering and now the voter suppression stuff that's happening. Where do you think we're going? Have we dodged a bullet, or are we in the eye of the storm right now?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think which metaphor is closer. I don't think we're out of the woods, to throw in a third. I think we're the woods in the eye of the hurricane. No, wait, never mind. We're not out of those. I think the good news is ways in which we are waking up. I think we're more aware of cognitive biases. My way of looking at the so-called psychology of tribalism, which is just another way of saying we're naturally groupish. We congregate in groups, and we will we can, under certain circumstances, have a bias against other groups, or at least process information in a way that works to the advantage of our group and against the other group. The cognitive biases that constitute this kind of groupishness, this psychology of tribalism, I think some of them are getting more and more attention. That's good. Like confirmation bias is a famous one, where it's now famous, and it wasn't 30, 20 years ago, where information that's consistent with your pre-existing beliefs you embrace and remember, and information that doesn't support your pre-existing beliefs you reject or don't remember. People are more aware of these. There's one that I can get into if you want, that I think people aren't aware enough of, a cognitive bias, but the general growing awareness of the ways the mind is not, should your own, the idea that your own processing of the world should be viewed somewhat skeptically, because we're all prone to these biases. That, I think, is getting out there more and more. Now, that's only the first step toward actually significantly neutralizing the problem or overcoming the problem, because these biases are very subtly ingrained, I think, in the way we view the world. And one thing I like about mindfulness meditation is that I don't think it's easy to well, it's not easy for me to even focus on 5 consecutive breaths. So meditating generally is not easy for me, but it holds the potential to make us more aware of subtle ways our mind is being warped by feelings, by biases, and so on, and better able to surmount that. That's like a good thing, I think. I still think there's a tendency of people to say, oh yeah, cognitive biases, man, I see those in the other tribe all the time. It's a serious problem. Well, no, it's a serious problem for all of us. And my newsletter is now called Nonzero. Its predecessor, when I first started a newsletter, was called Mindful Resistance, because this goes back to 2017. My Buddhism book had just come out, and I thought the resistance was not being mindful enough. It was being too reactive, I thought, to Trump, playing into his hands, denouncing his supporters en masse. They're all racists, or they're all this. And that just plays into his hands and confirms his narrative and the narrative he sells to his supporters, that we hold them in contempt and we're these snooty coastal elites and we think we're better than them. It's just, you're just doing him a favor when you denounce all his supporters. And I think you're often doing him a favor when you fall for his bait generally and get outraged at certain things. Not all. You have to get outraged at certain things. This is definitely the case. But, so I have had the kind of uphill struggle of trying to convince people who share my dislike of Trump that it's best to be kind of careful in the way you try to exert resistance to him when he was president, or to what he represents now. I just think we all we all self-examination is a good thing for us all, and I like meditation because it's a tool that can be used toward self-examination. But I think, I mean, so I see hopeful things. I could talk about more hopeful things that I see, but I guess what is worrisome is that I really think we need to see broad-based progress on this front. Real self-examination, self-awareness, and it's just hard. I mean, my view is we're designed by natural selection to not be good at that.
Yeah,
you know, like it built in the biases naturally. It didn't build brains that are good at spotting the biases. That's what biases are. Things that are hard to spot. Right.
And a brain that could be conscious of itself doesn't make sense, right? It's the snake eating its own tail.
Well, there's that problem too. The intrinsic, the fact that if there is there has to be a level of just in principle, a level of unconscious information processing. There has to be. It's like, just ideas spring to mind. Well, where did they come from, right? Yeah. So that has to be the case, and so it just. It's just obvious at one level we're not aware of a lot of what's going on in our brain at the conscious level. And some of that's fine, but some of it isn't.
Yeah, I'm always interested how, like, sometimes in a dream we'll be surprised by something. You like whatever, a blue dragon, like, oh, where'd that come from? Well, it came from the same brain that's experiencing, it's like, how can a surprise come from the same place that's perceiving it? It's,
And aren't you the director of the movie? You generated the dream.
You wrote the screenplay, man.
Don't you know?
Yeah, exactly. It's strange when you were talking. I was thinking how, like here you and I are two, on a global scale and a historical scale, very wealthy people with a lot of free time, and yet we struggle with this self-awareness and this, trying to find the consciousness to filter out or to recognize our own biases. And then you think about most people who are just so overwhelmed with responsibilities and childcare and, going to some job they don't like. And it feels hopeless. Because it's not enough for college professors and writers and journalists to, figure this stuff out. There are hundreds of billions or hundreds of millions more of them than there are of us. We're still outnumbered, even if everyone who had the opportunity could meditate and really think about these things, it still feels like the deck is stacked against us because so many people are so preoccupied just with survival. And I feel like now that's an even bigger issue.
Yeah. Well, also, it's not as if all college professors have figured it out. I mean, if you look at the kind of red and blue tribes, so to speak, in America, they are led by elites. They're led by college professors and journalists and lawyers and so on. And, these are very capable people who seem to have figured out at either a conscious or an unconscious level that the way you raise your stature within your tribe is to increase hostilities between the tribes, right? I mean, it's like the way you can get a lot of retweets if you're, say, in the blue tribe, like me, more or less, is to, like, find a video of some Trump supporter freaking out in a supermarket because somebody told him to put on a mask and, like, call them an idiot, and you get a billion retweets. And what you're doing is fostering the idea that all Trump supporters are like that. And like, no, they're not. I mean, so as a result, the examples that the blue side sees of red behavior and that the red side sees of blue behavior are the worst examples. I mean, that's because that's what circulates on social media. And there are some, people who have really risen to great heights on Twitter and are very smart people who have done it largely by distorting their tribe's view of the other side. And or in other ways deepening the antagonism between the tribes. And look, I'm not saying there's not a place for criticizing the ideas that you don't like on the other side, or like the powerful people who are espousing the ideas and so on. I'm not talking about a strategy of passive resistance. I'm just getting back to your point. Is like, first of all, it's not like all the elites have it figured out. All the people on either side, they're part of the problem. And also, some of the people who you described who really have a hard time making ends meet, they're not part of the problem because they spend all their time making ends meet. Some of them are. There are people who fit that description who are rabidly in support of their tribe, so to speak, to a point that's not productive. But a lot of them don't have time or inclination to hang out on social media making things worse either.
Is there a point where corporate power is going to come in and shut this down? Because it's not, my understanding is that, significant, serious corporate power wants stability. They want to be able to make 5-year plans. They want global trade to proceed unencumbered by this kind of nonsense. And they run the world, right? Or when I say they, I don't even mean people. I mean institutions and, the sort of forces of globalization. It seems like it's time for them to come in and say, sit down and shut up, you guys. You're starting to cut into our profit margin at some point.
Yeah, it's funny. I've long wondered, and I've wondered this more in the context of kind of international conflict, like war and stuff. But I've wondered why doesn't capitalism do a better job of making the world safe for itself?
Right.
It's like there's a lot of values that capitalism has that I don't share, and I wouldn't want them implemented. But it does have an interest in stability. And although, because it wants a platform on which to make money, and although that can have its downsides, there are forms of stability that are so pernicious you have to fight them. Still, I've kind of wondered, like, why do corporations so tolerate America's recent penchant for destabilizing the world with pointless wars and things?
Yeah. Yeah, aside from the corporations that are profiting on the wars.
Yeah, I mean, there's the arms manufacturers and, insidiously, the big digital companies now have contracts with the Pentagon. Google, Amazon and Microsoft were fighting over some big cloud computing contract with the Pentagon. And I've, heard Jeff Bezos say, gosh darn it, you gotta, how can people question the importance of keeping our country strong? And it's like, well, is that really what the Pentagon's been doing? I mean, and look, I come from an Army family. I grew up around the Army. My father was an Army officer, and I really have genuine respect and affection for the military. I really do. But I don't see how you can look, and it's not the military that decides how to throw our military weight around, right. By the way. Those decisions generally come from politicians. But how can Jeff Bezos not understand that some of us look at the way military force has been deployed by the U.S. for the last, a few decades, and even before then, for sure, in some ways, but and have doubts about whether the Pentagon's really doing a great job of keeping us secure in the sense that we want to be secure. But anyway, it does go. You're right. You're right that in some ways it's not a mystery that not all corporations seem to be trying to rein in America's reckless use of force, because some of them, the arms makers, and increasingly, and this is alarming, when you think about it, when you look at all of the things, the kinds of influence that the Silicon Valley companies have, right? Especially if they have control over social media or something, I mean, Google has a huge amount of influence over what we see and what we don't see. They've got YouTube. They've got the search algorithm. And so for them to have had Pentagon contracts, and they have, for them to have a kind of symbiosis with the military-industrial complex and to be part of it is to me disturbing.
What do you think about the idea that, earlier you were talking about the sort of central the trajectory of Nonzero, and how you talked about how single cellular organisms became multicellular and social, and sort of this increasing trajectory toward complexity, and then we arrive at Homo sapiens, arguably the most complex, most social organism on the planet.
Well, I'm not sure about most social, but I mean, if you compare us to ant societies or something, are pretty intricate and amazing. Yeah. But we're maybe in a way more complexly, more open-endedly social. Yeah, I'd agree.
And ants haven't come up with an internet, as far as I know.
No, we're definitely. I can safely say on behalf of our species, we are smarter than ants.
Well, I don't know, but see, there's where I might not go with you. Smart. We have to define smart. But anyway, what do you think about the idea that humans have congregated into larger superorganisms, which are governments, religions, institutions, and so on? And the trajectory of intelligence is toward a merging with technology, and that what Google and these other data collecting mechanisms are doing is basically learning how to be human. Ostensibly at this point, they're learning about our behavior so they can sell us things better, and they can make more money on advertising by targeting. But also they're learning how to speak. They're learning how to listen. They're learning how to think. They're learning how to be human. Are we a larval form of intelligence?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't think it's crazy to talk about the human species becoming a superorganism. And by the way, ant societies are considered superorganisms. Some biologists would use that term about them, because an ant colony, it's as if it were a single mind saying, "Where's the food? Go get it, bring it." It's like, they process information in some ways. It's like a single brain.
But there is no brain. There's no leadership. It all just happens.
It's pretty decentralized. Yeah, it's in the. There's a headquarters, and and in principle, a superorganism could be either like an animal. An animal can have a pretty distributed information processing system, or a more centralized one. But anyway, the idea that we are in some sense becoming a superorganism is, it creeps some people out, and it raises some creepy questions. And but I don't think it's an outlandish form of speculation. There was this. Do you know the name Pierre Teilhard de Chardin? Sure. This theologian / philosopher, Jesuit priest, also paleontologist, who lived about 100 years ago, and his work was banned for a time by the Catholic Church because he had a very radical theology. But he thought of humankind as he was very ahead of his time, because even like 100 years ago, he said, or maybe 90 or something. But anyway, he's like, look at all these information technologies, folks. It's like, telephone, radio. They are binding this, they are making the species in some ways more super organic. And he thought that this was, for the entire global species to come together and form, in some sense, you could say maybe a single organism, but in any event, in his view, to be bound by love, okay, he saw that as the culmination of kind of divine purpose. That he thought we were moving toward point omega. And I would say if the choice is between being a superorganism that's kind of coerced into being or something, or that is, I don't know. I don't know if I can flesh out this thought. I guess I would just say that I certainly agree with him that we need to become a more unified species. Whether, what you cross the line toward superorganism, I don't know. But I also agree with him that for it to happen in a way that's good for all of us and works toward the greater good, it needs to be it needs to involve a feeling of real goodwill toward other human beings and a breaking down of the kind of cognitive and emotional barriers to that feeling, and more in the way of mutual understanding and understanding the way people in different circumstances look at the world, different from us, and using that understanding to just reduce the amount of conflict and behave in a more globally harmonious fashion. I mean, you're raising the additional question of does technology, correct me if I'm wrong, you're raising the question of whether technology at some point becomes a more important part of the infrastructure than us, or something right? Like a superorganism where the bulk of the intelligence is embedded in the silicon or something, right?
Yeah, and also, I think my vision of this is quite a bit darker than yours, I'm afraid, because I think we already are embedded in superorganisms. I think that, Exxon, for example, is a superorganism. I often say, if the CEO of Exxon went to Peru and took ayahuasca with his son and had an epiphany and went back to his office Monday morning and said, guys, we got to stop this deep water drilling. We're destroying our planet. This makes no sense. He'd be out of a job. Exxon wouldn't change course, right? Nobody runs Exxon. Exxon runs itself. The participants are replaceable. And so and it's in our language, Exxon believes that the environment is how can Exxon believe anything? Exxon has no brain, right? Exxon is not a biological entity. And yet we accept that Exxon has, the rights of personhood in American law. It can evaporate and come back in another name and avoid taxation and avoid, what Chevron's doing right now in Ecuador, just evading responsibility for destroying entire ecosystems. I think we're already there. I think it's kind of like we're worried about the aliens coming and enslaving us. It's already happened. We're enslaved. We live on a planet that's ruled by these superorganisms, and we're wondering, why do people? It makes no sense. Why do people destroy their own water supply? Well, we're not doing it. These superorganisms within which we're embedded are doing it, and they don't give a damn.
Yeah, No, I take your point. There's so much I want to say in response. For one thing, you said, Exxon isn't like it. It's not a mind. It's not a brain. Although, if you want us to take the superorganism idea seriously with respect to Exxon, I think you have to entertain the possibility that, it's like it is like something to be Exxon. Maybe there is a unified Exxon. That's a semi-crazy metaphysical speculation that is worth entertaining, not so much with respect to Exxon, but if you want to look well into the future, could the human species acquire some kind of unified consciousness? I think, who knows? That's an interesting question. But back to how dark the view is. First of all, there are psychedelics. It's an interesting cultural thing. Is that more people are it's more respectable. Now, I don't consider psychedelics a cure-all. It could be that if you gave the head of Exxon Psychedelics, he would have some mystical experience about how important it was to increase Exxon's revenues. You can't rule that out. I mean, it's an unpredictable thing. I mean, look,
That's
Steve
what
Jobs,
I was going to say, Steve Jobs, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, he took psychedelics, steered him into Apple, after which he spent his life trying to attain total world dominance for Apple. Look, he produced some really beautiful stuff, and in a way he was more interesting than the average CEO, and he certainly emphasized the aesthetics of products more and so on. But you can't tell me he wasn't a ruthlessly competitive person, and he was, spent his time, put in his hours as a young acid head, So, but at the same time, I mean, I think, the Michael Pollan book about this helped kind of legitimize the book, How to Change Your Mind, helped legitimize this form of exploration, which I think, again, doesn't have guaranteed good results and can have, very bad results. I wouldn't advise anyone to do this stuff casually. But it's, and just at a more mundane level, corporations are responsive to popular feedback. Now it may be that the various green initiatives that oil companies do is just PR bullshit, and a lot of it is, but they do care about how they're perceived. And I mean, the other thing is, like, I drove through Kansas a couple of years. It's like there's windmills everywhere. I mean, there is, some change in the composition of energy that I don't, it isn't just driven by economics. I mean, I think increasingly it may be driven by economics as the technology gets better and more efficient and so on. But, our society hasn't been totally blind to these things we need to be paying attention to. The thing that drives me more to despair than anything is to see the way our media reports on just world events, like certain designated enemies, like Iran, or I was just reading a story. I'm writing about this now for my newsletter, but a story that David Sanger and a couple of other people wrote for the New York Times about cyber hacking and, like, how are we going to respond to the Russian solar wind hack? And it doesn't note anywhere in the whole piece, we do exactly the same thing all the time. We just get caught less often. And Russia's not the kind of society to publicize it. We're doing the exact same thing, and the article is all about, like, how are we going to retaliate to rein this in? We're retaliating 24/7, man. We just do this all the time. Right. And so to have, like, U.S. media outlets who seem to think it's their mission to not give us an objective view of the actual situation, right? Like, I thought reporters were supposed to try to give us an objective view of the actual situation, and I just see this everywhere in our in foreign relations, in reporting about foreign affairs, in most of the foreign policy establishment. Which is, here's another piece of progress, though, is there now is a derisive term for the foreign policy establishment, the blob. That's now known in Washington, okay? And it's like, and there is, more in the way of a non-blob element criticizing the blob. There's a little progress there.
You've been working in alternative. I mean, you're really interesting because you've been everywhere in mainstream sort of conventional media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, like, name a publication, it seems you've got a byline there or have at some point. And yet you've been in sort of taking advantage of alternative platforms a long time. And your Blogging Heads thing was one of the first sort of YouTube-based discussion sort of video.
It was before, it wasn't even YouTube-based. It was before Google even bought YouTube. Huh. It was we started in 2005. Yeah, but
Mickey Kaus, was it
but
Slate?
yeah, it was an early audio video podcast.
You did that with Mickey Kaus as well? Right.
Right. He was the co-founder along with a guy named Greg
And
Dingle.
was
Yeah.
Mickey at Slate early on?
We both had been at Slate from early days because we had worked at the New Republic when Mike Kinsley, who founded Slate, was the
Right.
editor. And Mickey was at Slate. I don't know if I was still writing. I was still probably writing for Slate a little still when we started Blogging Heads, but not that much. But he was there. I think he still had his blog there, Kaus
Yeah,
Files.
yeah. I love Slate
but-
back in the day. I don't love it so much now, but
Well, Mike was, he was a great editor at both the New Republic and Slate, and real genius. But no, I still occasionally write for conventional media. I had a piece about this foreign policy stuff in the Washington Post a couple of months ago on espousing what I call progressive realism, a foreign policy alternative to the blob's view. But now most of my writing is for my newsletter or else books, and that leaves me free to care less about whether there will be blowback for denouncing various people like David Sanger of the New York Times, or and I think you need that freedom because denunciation is sometimes in order.
yeah. Were you feeling constrained? Or did you just see the potential of these alternative independent platforms early on?
I don't think there was really a big plan. Blogging Heads just seemed like an interesting thing to try when I realized it was technically feasible. This was before it was done by broadband. Broadband connections weren't robust enough to sustain a good video signal. So you had to have a workaround if you wanted to have a side-by-side video conversation that you could post online. And when I realized that was possible, I just got interested in the thing. But I've just been interested in exploring technological possibilities for a long time. I wrote about the internet. There was a New Republic story in, I don't know, maybe 94, 95 or something, a cover story that was about my experience with the internet when many of our readers hadn't had the term, and virtually none of them were on it. So I've always, been kind of interested in technology.
Yeah, that's interesting. You've got such a vision into prehistory, but you're also very much looking forward. And I'll end where I began. I really admire your appetite. Your intellectual appetite is omnivorous. You're everywhere. It's great. It's admirable.
I wouldn't go that far. There are plenty of people who are living happy lives entirely unaware of it, believe me. The more than I'd like. But that's the other thing about the current media environment is just it's so segmented.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's strange. I think podcasts are fantastic. I think, we're like in the early days of the printing press. The fact that you and I can talk about anything we want, push a couple of buttons, and have tens of thousands of people listening to it in 20 minutes is just amazing. With no...
Right, but the more people who do that, the harder it's going to be to hang on to the tens of thousands.
Yeah, I know.
Which is what's happening now. But that may be
Let me finish by asking you for some recommendations. I'd just love to know what someone like you, what books would you recommend? I'd say my audience is probably mostly 25 to 40, looking for an alternative way to live life. The American dream isn't really there, and alternative approaches. So I'm interested. What books, what music, what films, what do you recommend to young people? I know you teach. You teaching at Princeton now or Union Theological?
I'm not doing any teaching now. Princeton was the last place I taught a couple of seminars on Buddhism while I was writing my Buddhism book, and then I had an affiliation with Union Theological Seminary. Actually, this kind of historically a kind of famously left-wing seminary in New York. But I'm not doing any teaching now. A book I've been listening to is this book, The Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson. It's about this woman named Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize for being as much as anybody responsible for the development of this technology called CRISPR-Cas9, which is itself, I think, it's both a promising and a scary technology. It's a gene editing technology that's going to make it possible to intervene in human evolution in ways that could have good effects and could have scary effects. And, to bring us back to this apocalypse aversion project, I mean, I think one reason we have to get, establish international laws and norms, to govern some of these things is that if you imagine, the power to change the human species, to edit the genes in ways that are heritable, if you imagine that unfolding in a context of intense international competition, right? Like where we don't know what the Chinese are doing and we fear they're building super soldiers or whatever, then no nation is going to be able to regulate this stuff in a sane way, right? Because they're going to be too freaked out about what the other nations are doing. And there is a lot of promise here, so it's not like you want to stifle it completely, but obviously a lot of bad things can happen. I mean, similarly, just forget human genetic engineering, the bioweapons you could design and unleash, and that thanks to this technology, I think, and other technologies, relatively small groups of not all that well-funded people could design in a college lab or something. So that's another thing where I think we have to get it under control at a global level. Anyway, I digress. It's the book is two things. It's an interesting story about a fierce scientific race, and the human ego is fully on display here, and there are patent disputes, and there's a question of who will win the Nobel Prize. Jennifer Doudna does. And then the section of the book I'm getting to now is laying out these questions, some of the questions and concerns. I'm not through that part yet, but Walter Isaacson, the author, is a very smart person, and I don't doubt that he'll do a good job of that. So that's what I've been listening to, book-wise.
Does he read it?
Musically, I'm so far out of touch. You don't want to hear my views.
No, I do. Do you listen to like classical music or jazz or what do you? Is music an important part of your life or not so much?
If I'm working, I might listen to classical or jazz just because it has no words, so you don't get distracted. Right. But I quit paying attention to new music. As people get older, they often do that. Your music obsessiveness, I think, tends to climax around your 20s, probably your early 20s or something. And I've kept less and less in touch. It was funny. The Grammys were just on, and my wife said, the Grammys are on tonight, or were on tonight. What's the difference from my point of view? And I just said, boy, you talk about a world where I would be completely out to sea.
I'm the same.
I bet there's not a song in the running for anything that I'm familiar with.
Yeah. I watched the Super Bowl this year, just because it's the Super Bowl, not because I really care about football. And the halftime show was by someone I had never heard of. And I thought, wow, the halftime show at the Super Bowl. That's how out of touch I am.
I'm trying to think of the name. I had heard the name, but I didn't. The fact that I can't remember now tells you I wasn't very familiar.
It was like Weekend or something like that. but spelled strangely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 59.
Yeah,
I'm roughly your age, so. But I mean, I listen to late Beethoven quartets probably once a month. Some Chopin ballades. And as you say, they're things that I became familiar with in my early 20s. But they're.
Yeah. No, I like the popular the rock and roll from that era, and and even a certain amount of stuff since then that I've liked. It's like I can see the appeal of contemporary music. I just don't follow it.
Yeah. Who's got time?
So how do you hang on to such a young audience if you're as old as I am?
I'm their funky
You're their kindly grandfather.
Well, uncle. Let's keep it at uncle for now.
Okay.
Maybe grandfathers.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm old enough to be some of their grandfathers, probably. But I mean, I think there's a missing older male figure in a lot of people's lives. And I think that a lot of popular podcasts are sort of connecting with that. Someone like Joe Rogan. Do you know Joe Rogan? You know who he is?
I know he is, for sure, yeah.
So he's a friend of mine. I've been on his show a lot, and that's...
Oh, tell him to have me on his show.
Well, yeah, the thing about Joe is nobody tells him what to do, so...
No, I mean, I want an order issued. I mean to command him, and I want you to tell him that if it comes to it, you're willing to get physical.
I'll slap him around on your behalf.
Go toe-to-toe.
How about if I tell him you're willing to go physical? But
don't tell him.
A lot.
Tell him.
A lot of people who've been on my show do go on and do Joe's show. Like, he's aware of guests that I've had on. So. And sometimes that works out really well, and sometimes it doesn't. He's had a few people on that I recommended that it didn't work out at all.
Didn't work?
No.
You don't want to name names, probably.
Well, the one I'm thinking of was a dominatrix, and I think she just made him very uncomfortable. But you don't have that same kind of energy, so I think it would be fine for you.
Actually, I like to think I have the energy of a dominatrix.
Just don't show up.
I'm just not a dominatrix. Yeah. It's a different kind of energy.
Don't show up in latex thigh-high boots. That's my advice.
No danger of that happening.
Right. Hey, Bob, thank you. I know you're a busy man, and I really...
Thank you, Chris. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I will... Where can people find all your stuff? They should sign up for your newsletter. I get it.
Nonzero newsletter. It's on Substack, and also, some of the older archives are at nonzero.org. But the on Twitter, I'm Robert Writer, WRIGHTER. And those are my show. The podcast is the Wright Show, which is on YouTube. It's on some of them are on the Blogging Heads platform. The others on the Meaning of Life TV platform. The more kind of philosophical ones. And you
have a website, which you haven't looked at in a long time, apparently.
No, don't go to robertwright.com. That's been under construction for millennia.
It had the ipsum, the strange filler text.
Yeah, some of it's in Latin. Yeah. In Latin. If you read Latin, go there and tell me what it says.
All right, thanks, man.